Were your ancestors poor? Did they not have much monetarily? Are you losing them in the research records because of that? They didn't generate a lot of records, right? Well, you're in the right place. Stay tuned because we are going to be talking about tracing your ancestors when they had very little, or tracing your poor ancestors. Hi, I'm Lisa Liston with Are You My Cousin, and I strive to take the overwhelm out of your genealogy research. Now, before we start talking about our ancestors a little bit more, I'd love for it if you wouldn't mind going ahead and hitting the subscribe button below. That way you will be notified when new videos come into the Are You My Cousin YouTube channel, typically twice a week, and I'd love for you to enjoy more videos. Okay, so let's start talking about our poor ancestors. Now, one of the first things you need to understand when it comes to researching your ancestors who had very little money is that, or who had no money, is that you need to understand how the community took care of their poor. In other words, how the county, typically this was at the county level, but how did they take care of people who had little and who needed assistance? Now, it's not a new concept to take care of the poor. And early on in most areas, you typically had churches or vestries who took care of the community's poor. But later on, at least here in the US, it eventually went over into the county side of government, and they were the ones who would help to take care of the poor. Now, the names of the agencies that did this early on and up into today's times change. They vary from state to state, so don't let that throw you. As I have always said, when you are researching an area or a new record set in a specific area, make sure you understand what the records are before you start trying to find your ancestors in those records. That way you will not spend a lot of time or waste time trying to find your ancestors in a record that maybe really never had them in it to begin with. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about specific types of records that your ancestors who were poor might have generated. So one of the first things you might think about is checking the Poorhouse List. And this is actually kind of think of it in terms of a census or a roster of who was living in the actual poorhouse. Now, typically the counties would have that listed out. They might have dates of entering, dates when they left. And one of the tips I usually like to tell people is check these particularly for your female ancestors, because unfortunately, there is going to be a higher proportion of women on these lists, these poorhouse lists, than men. It just sort of seemed to be that way, as women, if they were widowed or abandoned, they typically, or they could have easily ended up in dire straits. So check the poorhouse list for women and children as well. Now, there's another type of list that you might want to check, and it's called a paupers list. Now, this can be different, again, state by state. But there is a list, oftentimes it might be a list of the poor, but who were not living in the poorhouse. So just because your ancestors were poor, or they didn't have to be living in the poorhouse to be notified in these records. Sometimes they were living at home, or they were living with a family member, but they were receiving county monies. And again, remember, this is always about the money and keeping track of the money from the county's point of view. So you might have a separate list, and I show an example in a recent post where I talk more about the county's poor records, and I'll show you, there are some examples there you can actually go look at of original records for a poorhouse list, a list of the poor who are living at home as opposed to being in the poorhouse, how much money they got. And the really cool thing about some of these records, guys, is that you may find little extra notes written in the margins about when somebody may have deceased, when they came in or when they left. It's a really interesting list to look at because you get some of that extra information that you might not have found anywhere else. Other types of lists that you might look at in the county records might be the minutes where the warden of the poor may have kept, or sometimes he was known as the overseer of the poor. The committee meetings, you can find minutes there. Occasionally you will find information in the county court minutes, less likely there, but occasionally you could find that. And when you are looking for those ancestors who left very few traces in the records, it's still worth looking in those records just to make sure. And also don't forget to check the account records for the overseer of the poor, because he would have had to have provided accounting of the monies that were given out to the poor, so to the county officials. So be sure and check for those as well. Lastly, there's actually a federal record that you can get some hints for the poor in your area, and that is in 1880 there was another schedule done, or an additional schedule done, called the defective, dependent, and delinquent schedule. That's their term, certainly not what we would use in today's terms, absolutely. But on that list, you will find what they call a pauper list as part of that schedule. And it tells you if somebody's in a poorhouse, or if they are poor, they will appear on that list as well. I actually found one of my ancestors on that list, and it sometimes will tell them why they are in that strait. So for instance, my fourth great grandfather appears on the poor list, or the pauper list, and he is described as being of old age, and that is why he is receiving county monies. He's no longer able to support himself. So there you have it, guys. Some places to check for records on those ancestors who really had very little means, who didn't own property, who didn't own much of anything, and perhaps were even in very dire straits. So try those out. I will put a link in the description below to the blog post that talks more about the poor records and gives some really great examples there that you can hop over and look at. Okay, guys, best of luck with your research. I would love it. Before you go, don't forget, hit that subscribe button down below, and you will not miss any of the Are You My Cousin videos. Have a great day, guys.